A flight attendant slapped a black dad while he was holding his baby, never realizing he was married to the owner of the entire airline. What happened next stunned the whole cabin. He thought striking a father would make him look in control. He didn't realize the man he touched was married to the person who controlled the entire airline subscribe. If you believe arrogance always hits the wrong altitude. Marcellus Dren's arm tensed just slightly as the words landed. "Excuse me, sir. I think you're in the wrong seat," said the flight attendant. The voice was smooth but sharp at the edges, like a dull blade pretending to be polite. Marcellus looked up from gently rocking Levi, his infant son who had just started to stir against his chest. He blinked once, calm and unbothered before reaching into the diaper bag for his boarding pass. "1A. That's us," he said, offering it without hesitation. Troy Karen, the attendant, took it with a mechanical smile, eyes scanning the document too slowly, as though hoping the ink would rearrange itself to prove him right. His brow furrowed slightly when the seat assignment matched. A tiny glitch in his expectation. He flipped the pass once, double-checked the code against the tablet cradled in his other hand. Family A. No last name. He muttered more to himself than anyone else. Marcellus could feel the scrutiny. It wasn't new, but it still stung. He adjusted Levi's blanket and rocked a little slower, allowing himself to focus on his son's soft breathing rather than the condescension inches away. Troy looked up again, scanning Marcellus like he was trying to solve a riddle with no answer he liked. "And who exactly booked this seat for you?" There it was. The real question behind the politeness. Not what was printed on the ticket, but how a man like Marcellus had ended up in a seat like this. "My husband," he replied plainly. "He travels often. I don't usually come with him." Troy's expression didn't change at first, but the muscles around his jaw stiffened. "Funny," he murmured, turning the ticket in his hand one last time. "We don't usually get charity cases in first class." Marcellus blinked. For a moment he wasn't sure if he'd heard it correctly. The cabin was still boarding. Noise filtered in from the front, the metallic clicks of overhead bins, the muffled voices of passengers settling in. Maybe he'd imagined it. Or maybe... "You say something?" he asked, not confrontational, just clear. His voice was low but firm, like a man used to reading rooms with caution. Troy had already turned halfway, facing toward the galley, pretending not to hear. But he let the words slip as if under his breath, yet just loud enough to land like glass on marble. "Some people take kindness too far," he said. "They forget who actually belongs up here." He walked off, the comment trailing like jet exhaust. Marcellus exhaled through his nose, pressing his palm gently against Levi's back to soothe him. The baby gave a tiny whimper and then went still. Marcellus didn't move. His spine remained straight, his head tilted slightly, as though absorbing the insult molecule by molecule. His mind was working through it, not out of rage, but from a place deeper. Older. A familiar weight had returned, the one he hadn't carried in a long while. He wasn't new to discomfort, wasn't surprised by cold glances or the raised eyebrows when he didn't wear a suit. But there was something in Troy's tone that wasn't just disbelief, it was certainty. The certainty of someone who believed the seat should be reserved for someone else, someone better, someone whiter. Across the aisle, a young male passenger glanced over briefly, clearly having heard at least part of the exchange. He looked down quickly, deciding it was easier to pretend nothing had happened. Marcellus didn't blame him. That's what most people did, and in some ways, it was easier. Pretend it didn't happen. Hold the baby. Keep the peace. He adjusted the small blanket around Levi again, making sure it covered the baby's arms. Levi stirred, eyes fluttering open for just a moment, then closed again. Marcellus whispered softly, "Shh. You're okay." More to the child than to himself, but maybe to both. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the last of the passengers boarded. A soft ding overhead. An announcement from the cockpit greeted them with the usual rehearsed calm. but Marcellus barely heard it. He watched Troy move up and down the aisle with mechanical efficiency, but each motion felt charged now. The man's posture was too upright, his glances too often returning to 1A like a mosquito circling a light. There was no doubt. Troy was watching him. Waiting. Marcellus leaned back, eyes unfocused now, remembering his husband's words before the trip. Just relax. Let them serve you for once. You deserve it. It had made him smile then. Rowan always said things like that, with quiet confidence, like the world should already be better because they were trying to raise someone good inside it. But sitting here now, feeling the weight of eyes that saw neither father nor child, just anomaly, Marcellus felt something else stirring. Not fear, not shame, just silence. And in that silence was a promise. Because something about the way Troy had walked away, muttering with impunity, made it clear. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a test. And Marcellus Dren had no intention of failing it. Some people take kindness too far, Troy said quietly, walking off. They forget who actually belongs up here. The slap landed with a crack, loud and sharp enough to pierce through the soft hum of the aircraft's engine. It wasn't just a hand against skin. It was a declaration. The cabin stilled. Conversation ceased mid-word. Utensils froze above trays. The subtle clink of a stirred drink at the rear of first class now felt like a hammer in a cathedral. Every passenger's gaze shifted toward row 1, where Marcellus Dren stood slowly, his baby still cradled against his chest, his cheek reddening beneath the echo of Troy's hand. For a heartbeat, it felt like the aircraft wasn't moving at all. Suspended. Frozen in judgment. Marcellus didn't speak right away. He looked down at Levi, who was now sobbing uncontrollably, his tiny fists curled into the fabric of Marcellus's hoodie. The slap hadn't touched the baby, but it had shaken the world around him. Marcellus rocked gently, instinctively trying to soothe his son, but the rhythm was mechanical. His mind was elsewhere, spinning. Troy stood inches away, his jaw tight, nostrils flaring. His right hand, the one that struck, hovered midair a second longer before he lowered it stiffly. His voice dropped into a venomous hiss. "Control your child or get off the plane." The audacity of it hit harder than the slap, and yet Marcellus didn't raise his voice. He didn't yell. He didn't lunge. Instead, he blinked. Once. Twice. Then, with careful precision, he adjusted Levi's position in his arms, shielding the baby's face from Troy. "Sir." A man's voice broke the silence. It was Devon, the younger flight attendant, stepping forward from the galley curtain with wide eyes. "Troy, what did you just do?" Troy didn't even turn around. "Handled it," he said flatly. "The situation was out of control." Devon's face flushed with panic. "You hit a passenger, in front of everyone." A cough came from somewhere behind them. A business-suited man in 3B shifted uncomfortably but didn't speak. No one did. Everyone had heard it, seen it, and yet not one voice rose in protest. Not yet. Marcellus finally moved, slow and deliberate, like someone calculating gravity before the next step. He gently placed Levi's diaper bag on the seat and turned, facing Troy directly. His voice, when it came, was ice wrapped in velvet. "You just made a very, very big mistake." His eyes never left Troy's face. There was no need for threats, no shouting, but something about the calm in Marcellus's tone made even Devon take a step back. Troy scoffed, trying to reclaim control. "You don't intimidate me," he said, though the cracks were beginning to show in his confidence. His voice pitched slightly higher than before. "I've worked here for 11 years. I know when someone's gaming the system. You're not the first to sneak into first class with a smile and a sob story." "Sob story?" Marcellus asked, not with disbelief, but with interest, like a man flipping through a manual and finding the last line that voids the warranty. Troy leaned in, clearly emboldened by his belief that no consequences were coming. "You think a cute baby and a soft voice get you privileges up here?" he hissed. "This isn't a charity flight. This is Aurora Jet First, and some people don't belong in the air." The words landed harder than the slap. This time, Marcellus didn't blink. He just inhaled deeply and tilted his head, registering not just the insult, but the flaw in the man's armor. That line. That sentence. It said more than any policy violation ever could. Devon, still hovering nearby, looked horrified. "Troy, stop. You're out of line. You need to walk away right now." Troy turned on him. "Or what? You'll write me up? Be my guest. I've handled worse than a crying baby and some guy pretending to be someone." Pretending, that word sealed it. Marcellus, holding Levi closer, glanced toward the front galley. A thin sliver of curtain still swayed from where Troy had barged through. No one else came. The captain hadn't appeared. The intercom hadn't crackled. No one had intervened. And that silence, deafening, deliberate, told Marcellus all he needed to know. He turned slowly, not away from Troy, but toward the elderly man in 1C who had been watching quietly. Their eyes met. The man gave the smallest of nods, silent witness. Marcellus took a slow breath and sat down, not in surrender, but in preparation. With one arm he bounced Levi gently again. With the other, he reached into the side pocket of the diaper bag and retrieved his phone. He didn't scroll. He didn't hesitate. He typed one line, one sentence, then sent it. He stared ahead at the curtain, then back at Troy, who now hovered like a storm cloud without direction. The tension hadn't lifted. It had merely shifted, condensed into something colder and far more dangerous than anger. "You just made a very, very big mistake." The slap rang out like a shot in the hush of first class. Marcellus didn't flinch, not visibly, but the fire behind his eyes flickered, quiet and precise. For a half-second, the cabin seemed to pause in disbelief. The soft hum of engines, the muted clinks of silverware, even the baby's breathless whimper, all swallowed by the echo of that open palm across his cheek. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lunge. He simply stood. Levi, startled by the sudden movement and the shift in his father's arms, began to cry louder. Marcellus turned, his hand cradling the back of his son's head instinctively, rocking him without a word. His gaze didn't follow Troy as the flight attendant turned on his heel and marched down the aisle. Instead, Marcellus scanned the cabin, passengers frozen, some looking away, some staring directly at him, eyes wide. Security was called before anyone could speak. The captain's voice came crackling over the cabin intercom a moment later. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are returning to the gate due to a passenger disturbance. Please remain seated." Marcellus didn't resist. He didn't speak. Instead, he stepped into the aisle, gently handed Levi to an older gentleman seated nearby, a man who had seen everything, whose expression was torn between pity and quiet rage, and then calmly reached into his pocket. His phone lit up with one touch. No overthinking, no drama, just a single text. He hit me. In front of Levi, he hit send. The captain himself came into the cabin moments later, a furrow in his brow and a hint of discomfort in his tone. "Sir, may I ask you to step into the galley with me, just to de-escalate the situation?" His voice was carefully neutral, as if afraid to take sides. Marcellus nodded, still calm, still silent. He walked slowly toward the galley, past the curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane, his steps even. Behind him, Troy followed with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. As the curtain fell behind them, Troy leaned in close. "People like you always push too far," he said under his breath. Marcellus didn't look at him. He didn't respond. Inside the galley, 2 other male crew members stood nearby, uneasy, unsure whether to intervene. One of them, Devon, glanced at Marcellus and then at Troy, his mouth parting slightly as if to say something, but the words never came. Then a sharp electronic ping interrupted the silence. Everyone turned, It came from the flight crew's internal tablet, a device reserved for high-level communications from headquarters. Messages didn't come through that channel unless something serious was happening. One of the crew tapped the screen hesitantly. A single line flashed in bold. Immediately halt flight lock cabin crew from further interaction with Seat 1A. Internal investigation initiated. Legal arrives in 12 minutes. Rowan H. The air shifted. Someone whispered, "Wait." Rowan H.? The captain stared at the screen. "That's not possible," he muttered, but the protocol was clear. He reached for his headset, his voice low and urgent as he radioed air traffic control. "We need to taxi to Auxiliary Hangar B, not the main terminal. Immediate compliance requested. VIP override in effect." The plane began to move. From the window of the galley, Marcellus watched as they veered off the taxiway toward a private hangar tucked far from the public terminal. A black sedan already waited there, sleek and silent, its engine running. The male crew members whispered amongst themselves now, uncertainty growing into panic. Troy glanced between them, confused. "What's happening? Why are we—" But no one answered. The cabin doors opened once the aircraft came to a full stop. Metal stairs were wheeled up, and then they saw him. A tall figure stepped out of the sedan, dressed in a charcoal gray coat. His pace was steady, controlled. He didn't flinch from the cold air. He didn't look around for cameras or crowd. Rowan Hargrave, CEO of Aurora Jet Holdings, owner of the plane, husband. The entire crew went pale. Devon nearly dropped his tablet. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Troy, that's him." Troy squinted out the window, not yet believing. "That can't be." But his words faded. Because Rowan was already ascending the steps, he didn't shout. He didn't wave security forward. He didn't speak until he was inside the aircraft. He walked through the cabin without a word, every passenger silent. The only sound the click of his shoes on the aisle floor. Then he reached the galley. Marcellus stood there still, expression calm. Levi back in his arms, cradled once again like nothing had ever disturbed them. Rowan stepped forward and gently took the baby into his own arms, pressing a soft kiss to Marcellus's cheek. "I'm here," he whispered. Then he turned. His gaze landed on Troy. "Get off my aircraft." Troy's mouth opened. He took a step forward, hands raised in panic. "Wait, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." "But you slapped him anyway," Rowan said, his voice cold and quiet. "So that tells me everything I need to know." The cockpit door shut with a mechanical hiss just as two security officers, both in plain dark uniforms, gripped Troy Caron by each arm and led him down the narrow aisle. His shoes scraped against the carpet as he stumbled, pale and stunned, trying to offer explanations no one asked for. "I didn't know," he kept saying, voice cracking, eyes darting to the rows of silent passengers who watched him with cold curiosity. "He didn't say who he was. I thought—" But his words dissolved into the stale air of the cabin. No one answered. No one defended him. Even Devon, the younger flight attendant who had once worked under him, looked away. Rowan Hargrave stood near the entrance to first class, expression unreadable, watching until the figure of Troy disappeared beyond the aircraft's exit door. The hum of the engines idling outside could barely muffle the weight of silence that had fallen over the plane. Without waiting for ceremony, Rowan turned to the remaining crew, his voice steady, every word crisp like glass being set down carefully. "There are two things we don't tolerate in this company," he said. "Violence and arrogance disguised as protocol." No one responded. Even the passengers, some of them still gripping armrests from the earlier shock, remained silent. Rowan's presence didn't demand attention. It absorbed it. His eyes shifted toward the captain, still standing awkwardly at the cockpit threshold. Uncertain if he should speak or step aside, Rowan took a single step forward. "I'd like a moment," he said. The captain nodded quickly and followed Rowan into the galley. The moment the curtain closed behind them, Devon exhaled slowly. He walked over to Marcellus, who was seated with Levi resting quietly on his chest. The red imprint of Troy's slap still colored his cheek, but his gaze remained calm and unreadable. Devon knelt slightly beside him, voice low. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I should have said something earlier." Marcellus didn't answer at first. He looked down at Levi's peaceful face, then back at Devon. "You said enough," he replied softly. "You stayed human. That matters more than you think." The curtain shifted as Rowan returned to the cabin, now alone. His posture was relaxed but decisive, and the moment he stepped into view, all crew members straightened. "This flight will continue," Rowan announced, scanning the cabin slowly. "But under new command, Captain Jarrell Cade will take over from the cockpit." A ripple of surprise passed through the crew. Devon's mouth parted slightly, then closed again. The name wasn't unfamiliar. Jarrell Cade was a seasoned pilot with a reputation for fairness and a deep history with Rowan. Minutes later, another vehicle outside delivered him directly to the aircraft steps. As the original captain exited with his suitcase and averted eyes, Cade entered briskly, nodding once to Rowan before disappearing into the cockpit without a word. There was no need for introductions. His presence was quiet authority. Rowan turned toward the passengers, stepping slightly into the aisle so all could see him clearly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean on status. "You are guests on an aircraft that bears my name," he said. "That means safety for all. Not just some. If anyone feels they can't fly under that promise, now's the time to leave. No cost. No judgment." No one moved. One man shifted uncomfortably, but his eyes dropped when Rowan looked at him. In that moment, the cabin felt like a courtroom, and Rowan had just delivered the final word. He gave a small nod, then quietly walked back to seat 1A. Marcellus hadn't moved. Levi stirred slightly in his arms, but didn't wake. Rowan sat down beside them, placed one hand gently over Marcellus's, and leaned in. "It's not about the seat," Rowan whispered, his voice like breath against stone. "It never is. It's about the weight behind it." The aircraft doors sealed. The engines roared to life again. Passengers sat straighter, unsure of what came next. But there would be no more drama. No raised voices. No hidden cruelty masked as policy. The plane lifted off the ground smoothly, carving through the evening sky as though cutting away the remnants of what had happened below. But the air inside the cabin had shifted, lighter for some, heavier for others. Justice doesn't always land with a bang. Sometimes it boards quietly and leaves no room for excuses. The slap echoed across the cabin like a dropped tray in a silent church. The sound stunned the passengers into breathless stillness, a few gasps rising and dying mid-throat. In Seat 1D, a young man named Ellis Varn, a systems engineer from Eastbridge, had already been quietly recording. Something in the air, from the moment Troy Caron first approached Marcellus, had felt off. The tension wasn't just about policy. It was something colder, sharper, the kind of suspicion that didn't come from rules, but from reflex. And now, Ellis's phone captured everything. Troy's slap, the infant's startled wail, Marcellus rising with a quiet, terrifying calm, and the moment the cabin crew froze like they had just witnessed a crime because they had. Ellis didn't wait. He tapped Save, then uploaded the clip to a private aviation watchdog forum he followed. No caption was needed, but he added one anyway. Flight attendant hits black passenger holding baby. Then his husband showed up. It wasn't clickbait. It was exactly what happened. Within 20 minutes, the post had thousands of views. Within an hour, millions. Before Flight 1065 had even touched down, the internet was on fire. As the jet continued its resumed course toward its destination, the atmosphere inside had shifted. It wasn't panic, but a hush of uneasy recognition. Flight attendants, previously brisk and assertive, now moved more cautiously. The one named Devon, who had spoken up earlier in defense of Marcellus, looked like he hadn't taken a full breath since the incident. He moved down the aisle quietly, bringing drinks and offering quiet apologies with his eyes. Rowan Hargrave, seated beside Marcellus now, said little. His posture was composed, but his fingers tapped a silent rhythm on the armrest, calculating, anticipating. His phone buzzed repeatedly. One after another, messages arrived. Board members, legal counsel, investors. Words like PR crisis, media containment, possible settlement blinked across the screen. Rowan silenced it all with a single message back to his assistant. No press conference, no press. There will be change. Marcellus stared ahead, cradling Levi gently against his chest. The child had calmed, sensing his father's steadiness, but Marcellus's mind churned, not with vengeance, but with weight. The slap wasn't just a slap. It was confirmation of what he'd always feared, that kindness wasn't always armor and dignity didn't always prevent the blow. He didn't need justice for himself. He needed to know it wouldn't happen again, to anyone. "Do we issue a statement?" One of Rowan's legal advisors texted, "Do we suspend the crew?" asked another. Rowan responded with a single sentence, "We transform the system." In the aircraft's rear galley, Troy sat with arms crossed, face tight and eyes darting. A junior crew member named Jace leaned toward him and whispered, "They're saying corporate's involved. Like top." Troy scoffed. "It's just noise. The guy's probably bluffing. I did what I had to do." But Jace didn't look convinced. His tablet screen had refreshed with an incoming directive from corporate, a suspension notice with an embedded video feed of the footage going viral. Even the crew's internal communication channel was buzzing with speculation. No one could ignore it anymore. The real weight, however, fell on the company's records. While Troy sat defensively in the rear of the plane, Aurora Jet's internal systems were already syncing data to a legal compliance server. His file wasn't clean. It hadn't been for years. Several past incidents, coded as guest interaction concerns, were buried in vague HR language. 3 formal complaints. 2 passenger statements marked unresolved. But nothing had ever led to suspension. Now, that paper trail had become a noose, tightening with every replay of the slap. One of the marketing heads raised his hand, hesitant, uncertain. Do we need to go public with this?" His voice trembled slightly. Torn between fear of backlash and fear of the truth, Rowan's response was instant. "We're not hiding the wound," he said, straightening to his full height. "We're cleaning it so it doesn't rot again." Across the table, the legal team exchanged glances, some anxious, some impressed. There was no turning back. Whatever Aurora Jet would become started in this room. Rowan let the silence sit for a moment longer, allowing the weight of his words to settle. Then he added with finality, "Because silence is what made Troy believe he was right." The moment the video hit the private forum, it detonated like lightning across dry fields. Rowan Hargrave had barely stepped off the aircraft when a notification pulsed on his phone. A friend from a partner firm sent the message with no text, just a link. He clicked it. The screen loaded a shaky but crystal-clear recording from Seat 1D, capturing Troy Caron's final, violent outburst. The slap, the hush, the stunned expressions, and then Rowan's entrance. A figure of composed authority and fury coiled into one. The final frame froze on Troy's face, drained of color as Rowan uttered the words that would soon become quoted headlines. By the time Aurora Jet's PR division caught wind of it, the video had already been mirrored across 8 different platforms. Despite efforts to pull it down, the hashtag began trending. I was one. At 2, Rowan watched from the back seat of the car as alerts kept rolling in. He said nothing, not to the communications director beside him, not to the security aide in the front. He simply stared, eyes sharp but unreadable. By the time they reached their residence, the clip had crossed 4 million views. And that was just the first night. Within 24 hours, the airline's general inbox had received over 3,000 emails. Some were furious, others supportive, but many, hauntingly, were confessions, stories long buried, typed out in late-night fury or quiet heartbreak. Men from all walks of life, engineers, teachers, musicians, even airline employees, described eerily similar scenes. Being asked to move, questioned without cause, treated as if their presence in first class were a clerical error that needed fixing. I was once downgraded mid-flight with no explanation. I was told to show ID again, even after boarding. I was 1A too, and I didn't have a CEO husband. Rowan sat in his home office, screen glowing dimly against the dark. Marcellus stood behind him, silent, holding Levi, who stirred in his sleep. "You can't answer all of them," Marcellus said gently. Rowan didn't look away from the screen. "I'm not trying to," he replied. "I'm listening." The next morning, Rowan called a private executive session, not just for the board, but for a newly formed group of 10. He selected each one personally: 2 pilots, a civil rights attorney, a customer service veteran, a behavioral psychologist, and 5 frequent flyers, all male, all from different ethnic and professional backgrounds. They had one mission: define what it meant to belong in the air. "We'll call it the Passenger 1A Task Force," Rowan said at the first meeting. "Not because we're glamorizing that seat, but because it's where this story started, and we are not letting it end there." Meanwhile, outside the boardroom, Aurora Jet's HR team received notice that Troy Caron's union had filed for an appeal. Their claim: Troy was acting under the stress of a disrupted cabin and was provoked. The phrasing was diplomatic, but the implication was clear. They believed his reaction was defensible. Rowan didn't react publicly. Instead, he called his legal lead and requested the release of the aircraft's audio log, specifically the cockpit-adjacent safety microphone near the galley, where Troy had made his most damning remark. The audio was clean, time-stamped, and unambiguous. "Some people don't belong in the air." That line became the tipping point. In a private meeting with legal counsel and ethics advisors, Rowan laid the file on the table. "No more silence," he said. "We don't need headlines. We need accountability." His voice was low, almost calm, but there was no mistaking the edge beneath it. His lawyer nodded. "This will nullify their appeal." Rowan tapped the folder once. "Make sure it does." That afternoon, a confidential internal statement was released to senior leadership. As of today, all appeals concerning Mr. Caron's behavior aboard Flight 1065 are denied. Further, any individual found to have had knowledge of previous complaints against him and failed to act will face secondary review under the revised oversight clause of Project Equaflight. When the aircraft finally descended through the clouds and touched down, it didn't taxi toward the regular terminal. It was guided toward a quieter gate, partially shielded from the public eye. But it was too late. News vans had already gathered beyond the fences. Microphones waved from behind barriers. Photographers pointed lenses toward the jet bridge inside the cabin. The silence continued. No one stood up immediately. Even the overhead chime felt strange, like a note out of tune. Rowan stood first. He offered his hand to Marcellus, who rose without a word, shifting Levi gently in his arms. No one blocked their path. Ellis Varn, still in seat 1D, watched them walk ahead. He hadn't expected the video to spread so quickly. He hadn't expected to feel responsible either. But he didn't regret it. Someone had to show what happened when arrogance masqueraded as authority. As they passed, he gave a quiet nod to Marcellus, one the father returned with a faint, respectful glance. Outside the jet bridge, security formed a protective corridor, but not for a celebrity spectacle. This was containment, controlled damage. Rowan had sent one final message through internal comms. "Let them pass. No questions, no interference." The crew obeyed. As Marcellus stepped onto the gate floor, a voice piped up from the crowd, a small voice, uncertain but clear. A boy, no more than 6 or 7, clutched his mother's hand and pointed. "That's the man from the video, right?" His mother followed his gaze. Her expression was solemn, not surprised. She nodded, voice hushed. "And the baby," she said softly. "They're the reason the skies are about to change." The room fell silent the moment Rowan stepped into the headquarters conference hall, the same silence that had hovered in the cabin 3 days earlier when Troy's hand struck Marcellus. That memory still lived sharp in the minds of the executives seated around the long oval table. As Rowan entered, Marcellus walked beside him, not as a figure of authority, but as the quiet center of the storm, steady, composed, but carrying the weight of what had been done. No introductions were made. No small talk softened the air. Rowan went straight to the front of the room, placing both hands on the table as if steadying the company itself. His voice cut through the tension like glass sliding across stone. "This isn't about one flight," he said, locking eyes with the department heads, HR, legal, operations, PR, each of them shifting uneasily in their chairs. "This is about a culture we've allowed to fester, a culture where badges are used like weapons, where policy replaces empathy, and where silence enables violence." The word violence echoed in the large room. Papers stopped rustling. A legal officer closed his laptop slowly. Across the table, a senior HR director swallowed hard, guilt flickering across his expression. Rowan turned slightly and gestured to Marcellus. It was a simple motion, but it made every man in the room straighten as if a verdict had just been handed down. "My husband doesn't want revenge," Rowan continued, his voice lower now, steadier, "but he demands truth." Marcellus stepped forward. At first, he didn't speak. His gaze traveled across the rows of men responsible for shaping Aurora Jet's culture, for protecting it, and for failing him. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, but the softness made it stronger. "I didn't want a scene," he said, fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "I wanted to hold my baby, and that man looked at me like I was a mistake that slipped through security." The sentence hit the room like a cold gust. One operations director lowered his head. The PR chief exhaled slowly, as if realizing for the first time the true scale of the damage. Marcellus continued, the weight of the moment pushing him forward. "If he didn't know who I was, then how many others has he treated like that, just because he thought they couldn't do anything about it?" Silence stretched so long that the hum of the overhead lights suddenly felt loud. That was when Rowan leaned in, voice returning with a fierce, controlled clarity. "Effective immediately," he said, each word landing with deliberate precision. "We're launching Project Equiflight Anonymous Reporting, empathy-based training, live passenger feedback integration, and every incident, every single one, will be reviewed by a rotating equity board. No exceptions." One of the marketing heads raised his hand, hesitant, uncertain. Do we need to go public with this?" His voice trembled slightly. Torn between fear of backlash and fear of the truth, Rowan's response was instant. "We're not hiding the wound," he said, straightening to his full height. "We're cleaning it so it doesn't rot again." Across the table, the legal team exchanged glances, some anxious, some impressed. There was no turning back. Whatever Aurora Jet would become started in this room. Rowan let the silence sit for a moment longer, allowing the weight of his words to settle. Then he added with finality, "Because silence is what made Troy believe he was right." The moment the video hit the private forum, it detonated like lightning across dry fields. Rowan Hargrave had barely stepped off the aircraft when a notification pulsed on his phone. A friend from a partner firm sent the message with no text, just a link. He clicked it. The screen loaded a shaky but crystal-clear recording from Seat 1D, capturing Troy Caron's final, violent outburst. The slap, the hush, the stunned expressions. and then Rowan's entrance, a figure of composed authority and fury coiled into one. The final frame froze on Troy's face, drained of color as Rowan uttered the words that would soon become quoted headlines. By the time Aurora Jet's PR division caught wind of it, the video had already been mirrored across 8 different platforms. Despite efforts to pull it down, the hashtag began trending. I was one. At 2, Rowan watched from the back seat of the car as alerts kept rolling in. He said nothing, not to the communications director beside him, not to the security aide in the front. He simply stared, eyes sharp but unreadable. By the time they reached their residence, the clip had crossed 4 million views. And that was just the first night. Within 24 hours, the airline's general inbox had received over 3,000 emails. Some were furious, others supportive, but many, hauntingly, were confessions, stories long buried, typed out in late-night fury or quiet heartbreak. Men from all walks of life, engineers, teachers, musicians, even airline employees, described eerily similar scenes. Being asked to move, questioned without cause, treated as if their presence in first class were a clerical error that needed fixing. I was once downgraded mid-flight with no explanation. I was told to show ID again, even after boarding. I was 1A too, and I didn't have a CEO husband. Rowan sat in his home office, screen glowing dimly against the dark. Marcellus stood behind him, silent, holding Levi, who stirred in his sleep. "You can't answer all of them," Marcellus said gently. Rowan didn't look away from the screen. "I'm not trying to," he replied. "I'm listening." The next morning, Rowan called a private executive session, not just for the board, but for a newly formed group of 10. He selected each one personally: 2 pilots, a civil rights attorney, a customer service veteran, a behavioral psychologist, and 5 frequent flyers, all male, all from different ethnic and professional backgrounds. They had one mission: define what it meant to belong in the air. "We'll call it the Passenger 1A Task Force," Rowan said at the first meeting. "Not because we're glamorizing that seat, but because it's where this story started, and we are not letting it end there." Meanwhile, outside the boardroom, Aurora Jet's HR team received notice that Troy Caron's union had filed for an appeal. Their claim: Troy was acting under the stress of a disrupted cabin and was provoked. The phrasing was diplomatic, but the implication was clear. They believed his reaction was defensible. Rowan didn't react publicly. Instead, he called his legal lead and requested the release of the aircraft's audio log, specifically the cockpit-adjacent safety microphone near the galley, where Troy had made his most damning remark. The audio was clean, time-stamped, and unambiguous. "Some people don't belong in the air." That line became the tipping point. In a private meeting with legal counsel and ethics advisors, Rowan laid the file on the table. "No more silence," he said. "We don't need headlines. We need accountability." His voice was low, almost calm, but there was no mistaking the edge beneath it. His lawyer nodded. "This will nullify their appeal." Rowan tapped the folder once. "Make sure it does." That afternoon, a confidential internal statement was released to senior leadership. As of today, all appeals concerning Mr. Caron's behavior aboard Flight 1065 are denied. Further, any individual found to have had knowledge of previous complaints against him and failed to act will face secondary review under the revised oversight clause of Project Equaflight. The report detailed, line by line, the events leading to Troy Caron's dismissal, the confrontation, the video, the internal audio logs. But the most damning revelation came midway through. 68 unreported or quietly resolved incidents involving Troy or his immediate team had taken place over the past 4 years. Most of them were logged as policy enforcement disputes, with vague language shielding the truth. Passengers removed, reprimanded, downgraded, all disproportionately male and overwhelmingly men of color. Several had filed quiet complaints. Most had received form responses. A few had been given vouchers. None had seen justice. Reading the report felt like peeling back wallpaper to reveal a wall full of cracks. Small, invisible, but dangerous in their pattern. Rowan had insisted it all be included. The legal team had resisted, worried about public backlash or lawsuits, but Rowan had said, "We're not protecting reputation. We're protecting future passengers." The report ended not with a corporate disclaimer or a public relations statement, but a short, personal message from Rowan himself. It read, "Air is for everyone. That includes fathers with babies, especially them." The applause had not started immediately. In fact, for several seconds after the hangar lights dimmed and the cloth was pulled away, no one moved. The crowd of AuroraJet crew members and their families stood frozen in silence, their breath caught, their eyes reflecting the glow of the fuselage. The aircraft stood tall beneath the soft amber lighting, sleek, pristine, silver-bodied with a deep blue underbelly. But it wasn't its design that drew emotion. It was the name etched in bold letters near the tail. Levi 1. Beneath it, in smaller print but no less powerful, were the words, "Kindness isn't first class. It's every class." Marcellus Dren stared at the lettering, shoulders still, hands clasped in front of him. He hadn't known until this moment Rowan had told him nothing, only that they were unveiling a new direction. As realization struck, his breath hitched. He turned slightly to his right, trying to shield his face from the gathering. The lights caught the glimmer of his eyes, but he said nothing. Rowan Hargrave stood beside him, his face calm, one hand resting on the small of Marcellus's back. His voice was low, meant only for him. "He was there," Rowan whispered. "He deserves to fly above it." Marcellus exhaled shakily. "You named a jet after him?" "I named it after all of you," Rowan said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "But yes, he was the one who couldn't speak that day. So this will speak for him." From the back of the group, a man in uniform stepped forward, former flight crew. His name tag read Ellen. He had trained under Troy Caron 3 years ago. He wiped his eyes with the cuff of his blazer and leaned toward a colleague. His voice broke slightly as he whispered, "Now, this is how you rewrite altitude." Then the applause began, hesitant at first, then rising like a wave, spreading from crew to families, technicians to executives. There were no press cameras, no investors, only the people who made AuroraJet what it had become, and the people it had once failed. The ripple of clapping filled the hangar with warmth, not noise. It was respect, pure and solemn. But what the audience didn't know, what Marcellus had been struggling with quietly, was the weight of approval. Not public praise, but personal peace. He never wanted recognition. He hadn't wanted to become a symbol or a lesson. He had only wanted to hold his child and get home. That slap, that violence had never defined him, but this plane, it was rewriting what came after. And it wasn't about image. It was about infrastructure, about systems remembering what people forget. A tall young man in a dark crew jacket approached Rowan discreetly near the wing. His posture was stiff, nervous. "Sir," he said, "I was one of the first recruits under Equaflight. Today is my final clearance before joining long-haul flights." Rowan studied him. "Name?" Jason Marlene," the man replied quickly. "I came through the expedited empathy track. My father used to work ramp for you. He told me what happened on 1065. Rowan nodded, then motioned toward Marcellus, who was now kneeling to adjust Levi's tiny shoes. "You know who that is?" Jason swallowed. "Yes, sir." "He never wanted a spotlight. But every passenger who walks onto your flight owes that man a safer journey. Remember that when things get hard at 30,000 feet. Jason nodded, his jaw tight with purpose. "I will, sir." Nearby, Levi let out a soft giggle as Marcellus lifted him up onto his shoulders. The toddler tugged gently at his father's ears, oblivious to the gravity around him. He bounced, laughing, tiny shoes swinging. Marcellus smiled up at him, not as a father in the spotlight, but just a man, trying to raise a child with dignity. Rowan turned toward the gathered crowd and lifted his hand gently. The applause faded. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. This aircraft won't be flying commercial routes for months. It's going to train our next generation of cabin leaders, not just in service, but in presence, in awareness, in listening, because that's what Flight 1065 taught us. Procedures can't replace perception. He let that hang in the air. Some of you were here that year. Some of you are just joining. But all of you carry this responsibility now. When passengers walk on board, they're not entering a service zone. They're entering our care. Levi 1 will be the standard, not in luxury, but in humanity. Marcellus watched Rowan step back, letting the team absorb the moment. He could see that some of the crew were emotional. Others stood straight, clearly aware that they were witnessing something that wouldn't be repeated. As the lights slowly dimmed, casting the aircraft in a soft, golden silhouette, a technician began closing the hangar bay doors. The atmosphere shifted to reverent quiet. No one wanted to be the first to leave. Ellen, the former trainee, remained beside his friend, still looking at the tail of the plane. He said it again, slower this time. Now this is how you rewrite altitude. The security footage began to play. It was the first day of training at Equaflight Academy, and the classroom had gone utterly silent. 34 cadets sat in rows of polished gray desks, their eyes fixed on the large wall-mounted screen. The room was brightly lit, modern, but filled with an invisible heaviness. On screen, the scene unfolded with raw clarity. Flight attendant Troy Caron storming down the aisle, stopping at seat 1A. The slap echoed. A baby's cry pierced the air. Then came the stunned silence. That was the moment the footage froze. No voiceover, no commentary, just reality. One cadet, a slim, dark-haired man in his early 20s, shifted in his seat. His throat tightened. His eyes glistened, and without realizing it, he whispered, "He looks like my dad," just trying to keep his kid calm. His voice cracked on the last word. Another cadet, broader and older, clenched his fists under the desk. He didn't say anything, but his jaw tightened as if swallowing rage. Across the room, an instructor, Mr. Alric Dane, a former purser with 18 years of experience, clicked the remote and paused the footage. His voice was quiet but firm. "We don't show this to shame anyone," Alric said, scanning the room. "We show it because pretending it didn't happen is how it keeps happening." The silence deepened. No one dared look away. The screen remained frozen on the image of Marcellus, standing after the slap, his face unreadable but powerful. The energy in the room shifted. Not just sadness or anger, but something harder to name, responsibility. The weight of knowing that one day it might be them standing in that aisle, expected to choose between convenience and conscience. Alric let the pause linger before continuing. Presence isn't just standing straight. It's recognizing when silence becomes harm. It's knowing the difference between policy and humanity. He clicked the screen off. Lights returned to full brightness. "Break for 5 minutes," he said. "Then we'll discuss." As the cadets filed out slowly, some still shaken, a pair of observers in the back of the room remained seated, unannounced, unintroduced. Marcellus Dren and Rowan Hargrave sat in the last row, hand in hand. They hadn't come to speak, only to listen. Marcellus hadn't expected to feel this again, the tension in his chest, the phantom sting on his cheek. But watching it from the outside, through the eyes of others, was different. He saw the look in the cadet's face, the one who whispered about his dad. That boy wasn't just training to serve drinks or recite safety instructions. He was training to decide what kind of man he wanted to be in the moment that tested him most. "Do you think they get it?" Marcellus whispered. Rowan's eyes remained on the front. They're starting to. 15 minutes later, the cadets returned. There was less chatter now, less fidgeting. The air had grown heavier, but also more focused. They weren't just students anymore. They were witnesses. Ulrich stood again. "Let's be clear," he began. "What happened on Flight 1065 wasn't just about one man losing his temper. It was about a system that let him believe he wouldn't be held accountable. You will be different. You must be." He turned to a younger instructor at the back, Mr. Jonas Veer, a former regional captain. "Jonas, would you?" Jonas stepped forward and held up a sleek card, the Equa-Flight credential badge. "This badge isn't just earned through flight hours," he said. "It's earned by knowing when to intervene, when to apologize, when to listen. That badge tells passengers they're not just getting service. They're getting safety, dignity." A hand rose. It was the same cadet who had whispered earlier. His voice trembled, but his question rang clear. "How do we know if we're doing enough?" It was then that Rowan finally stood. Heads turned. Whispers started. Some recognized him from news stories, some didn't. But everyone went still when he walked to the front of the room. He looked over the cadets, not with superiority but with clarity. "There's no perfect checklist," Rowan said. "No formula to tell you when you've done enough, but I can offer one measure." He paused, looking at Marcellus in the back, who now held Levi, bundled in a blue blanket, asleep in his arms. "When the child in seat 1A sleeps soundly, that's when you'll know." The invitation came without fanfare, but the seal on the envelope was unmistakable. Deep blue, encircled in silver, the insignia of the Federal Aviation Authority of Norva. It arrived at Rowan Hargrave's desk on a quiet Tuesday morning. Resting on top of a neat stack of reports, Marcellus noticed it before Rowan did. He reached for it, turning it over in his hands, frowning at the weight of the paper. Rowan looked up. "Something official?" Marcellus opened it carefully, eyes scanning the contents. "They want to meet. The FAA of Norva. They're drafting new protocols around anti-discrimination in aviation, and they want us to help lead the framework." Rowan leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly. Outside, the wind rattled the glass of their home office windows, and Levy's distant laughter echoed from the yard. Rowan folded his hands. "We never wanted to be a symbol," he said quietly. Marcellus nodded. But the symbol came anyway. That week, their calendar filled quickly. Not with interviews, they declined those, but with quiet meetings. Policy boards, ethicists, airline executives who had once dismissed equity programs as distractions. Now, they were calling for guidance. The story of Flight 1065 was no longer a scandal. It was becoming a case study. But Marcellus remained cautious. At one such session, held inside a minimalist boardroom overlooking the Norva skyline, he sat silently as consultants debated buzzwords. "We could call it Skyfare," one executive offered, "or cabin kindness." Marcellus finally spoke, his voice calm but cutting through the air like a blade. "It's not a campaign," he said. "It's accountability. Don't give it a name just to sell it." The room fell silent. Rowan glanced sideways at him with quiet pride. Even here, surrounded by polished suits and glossy binders, Marcellus had kept the focus honest. Back at Aurora Jet headquarters, the impact deepened. The newly formed Equa-Flight Academy was becoming a model others sought to replicate. New hires were no longer just learning safety drills and emergency procedures. They were learning how to de-escalate conflict without assumption, how to respond to discomfort with patience instead of posture, and how to recognize when their own silence became complicity. The story reached unexpected corners of the world. Civil rights committees began citing Aurora Jet's reforms in their evaluations of transportation industries. International aviation unions called for review panels inspired by the Passenger 1A task force. It wasn't the slap that made the impact, it was what came after. And then, on the exact anniversary of Flight 1065, The letter arrived. It was addressed in careful handwriting. No return address. Just a name in the corner. Kieran Rowan found it first and slid it across the kitchen counter to Marcellus without a word. Marcellus unfolded it slowly, expecting another message of support, but this one was different. The words were raw. My name is Kieran. My son, Elias, is 11. We adopted him when he was 3. He's smart, kind, and he loves to read on planes. But last year, during a flight, a crew member mocked his accent, asked him if he even understood the safety instructions. My boy didn't respond. He just looked down, and I didn't know what to say. I froze. I still think about that moment, wishing I'd done something. Marcellus stopped reading for a moment. His throat tightened. The letter continued. Then I read about you, about what happened on that flight. And more importantly, what you didn't do. You didn't shout. You didn't curse. You didn't fight to humiliate someone. You stood there and let the system see itself. Your silence spoke for my son when I didn't know how. Thank you for making the skies feel possible again. By the end, Marcellus's hands were shaking slightly. He passed the letter to Rowan, who read it word for word, then placed it gently on the table. A few days later, the framed letter was mounted on the main hallway of Equaflight Academy trainees, stopped to read it during every rotation. It became an unofficial rite of passage. Above it, Rowan added a small brass plaque. The quote on it was simple. It didn't shout. It didn't preach. It just stood still and carried truth. Empathy requires altitude. One afternoon, Marcellus Dren sat quietly in the far corner of the Dresden Regional Airport Lounge, his fingers gently stroking the soft curls on his son's head. Levi, now a chubby-cheeked toddler, lay curled against him in sleep, toy wings still clutched in his tiny fist. The lounge hummed softly with the indistinct murmurs of nearby travelers, the clink of coffee cups, and the occasional boarding call muffled through the glass walls. Beside Marcellus sat Rowan Hargrave, his husband, dressed in casual layers for once, no tailored coat, no corporate air. His phone rested face down on the armrest. For this moment, he had silenced the world. But moments like these rarely stayed untouched. A pair of footsteps approached, hesitant, uneven, almost reluctant. Marcellus felt the weight before he saw the source. A young man stood a few feet away, dressed in a crisp flight attendant's uniform, his blazer freshly pressed but his stance uncertain. His badge read L. Corman, but his eyes were the giveaway, nervous, darting, unsure whether to speak or disappear. "Mr. Hargrave?" the man asked, voice tight with anticipation. Rowan turned slightly, measured, always aware of his surroundings even when off-duty. His expression remained neutral, the reflex of a man used to being recognized for reasons both wanted and not. "No press, no questions," Rowan said, almost by muscle memory, gently shielding Marcellus and Levi with his tone alone. But the man shook his head instantly, hands raised as if to show peace. "No, sir, nothing like that. I just wanted to say thank you." Rowan paused, subtly straightening. Marcellus looked up then, brows lifting at the man's tone. Not entitled, not reverent, but raw, like someone rehearsing lines they'd never expected to speak aloud. "I used to think people like me didn't belong in this uniform," the man continued, eyes flicking between the floor and the sleeping child. "But then I saw how you handled him. You didn't yell. You didn't fight. You just stood still and let the truth speak." There was a silence, but not an awkward one. It felt earned. Marcellus studied him now, really studied him. Clean-cut, barely in his mid-20s, but there was something in the jawline, the posture, the shadow of someone else. "And you are?" Marcellus asked softly, not confrontational but with gentle curiosity, adjusting Levi slightly as he stirred. The man smiled, nervous again. "Devin's younger brother. My name's Luca. He told me everything after After that day, said you taught him the difference between rank and respect. Rowan's hand extended without hesitation. Then, welcome aboard, he said. Luca shook it, firm now. There was no hesitation in the grip, no second-guessing, just a silent understanding between men who had all, at some point, been questioned for simply existing where others didn't expect them. As Luca stepped back, adjusting his blazer with quiet pride, a subtle shift took place in the lounge. A child cried somewhere across the hall. A security announcement crackled faintly over the intercom. But none of it mattered. For that brief, perfect moment, policy didn't speak. Protocol didn't echo. Legacy didn't demand applause. There were only 3 men. One walking forward, finding his voice in a world that once told him he didn't belong. One holding a sleeping child, remembering every moment when silence had to speak louder than anger. And one who had once been slapped, judged, and dismissed, but chose to rise, not by force, but by standing tall. Marcellus's voice barely rose above the gentle hum around them, but Rowan heard every word as though it were etched into stone. "You can't program respect," Marcellus whispered, "but you can remember who showed it first." Levi stood at the front of his classroom, a paper model of an airplane in his trembling hands. The buzz of chatter from the other 12-year-olds faded as his voice broke through the silence, not loud, but steady. "My dad's not famous," he said, adjusting the folded wings of his model. "He's just someone who didn't hit back." Behind the glass-paneled door, Rowan Hargrave and Marcellus Drain stood quietly, shoulder to shoulder, watching their son speak with a kind of quiet wisdom that echoed the legacy they never asked for, but had built nonetheless. The classroom had no idea who the 2 men were, not really. The teacher, Mr. Dawson, knew only that Levi's parents were polite, always early for conferences, and never missed a school play. But to the world beyond these walls, they were the reason aviation shifted. Levi's words hung in the air like soft engine hum. A few classmates exchanged glances, unsure how to respond, but Mr. Dawson nodded slowly, visibly moved. "Thank you, Levi," he said. "That was brave." Levi smiled, then returned to his seat, the paper plane tucked under his arm like something sacred. Later that evening, Rowan and Marcellus sat on their rooftop deck beneath a violet sky, the distant whir of aircraft fading into the night. Levi was asleep inside, curled up under a comforter printed with miniature jets and wings. Rowan held a tablet in his lap, paused on a frame from a new documentary, one detailing Aurora Jet's transformation. "They sent the final cut," he said, tapping the screen gently. "It's airing next week." Marcellus tilted his head. "You watch it already?" Rowan nodded. "The last scene, it surprised me." He tapped again. The image shifted. A black screen. Then a narrator's voice, smooth, steady. "If you could speak to that flight attendant again, what would you say?" Rowan's own voice followed after a pause, soft and deliberate. "I'd thank him." The silence that followed was long, cinematic, and heavy. Then came the final line. "Because sometimes it takes one slap to wake up a sleeping sky." Marcellus looked away, blinking faster than normal. Rowan reached for his hand. "I didn't expect to say that, but I meant it." The documentary hadn't just chronicled the slap, it had charted everything after the training halls. The launch of Levi 1. The transformation of crew protocols. Testimonies from men who had never felt safe flying first class before, and woven through it all, quietly, respectfully, was Marcellus, never interviewed directly, but present in footage and memory, in still shots and quotes on training walls. The scene shifted again in Rowan's mind. Earlier that month he had stood in the back of a training session at Equaflight Academy. One of the new recruits, a young man with bright eyes and nervous hands, had raised a question during the ethics module. "What if we forget? Like, what if someone gets tired or angry or just lets old habits slip in?" An instructor had paused, then answered, then the system steps in, because it was built not to trust impulse but to hold space for the right response. But Rowan had stepped forward unexpectedly, drawing glances, and if the system ever fails, he said, the story will remind you. He had tapped the large screen where a still image of Seat 1A glowed faintly. This isn't just a policy. It's a promise that a child's cry is not a threat, that a father's silence doesn't mean weakness, that respect is not optional. That same evening, Marcellus had wandered into the hangar where Levi 1 was undergoing routine maintenance. A single crew member was there, Jackson, a former baggage handler turned steward after retraining through Aquaflight. He stood near the aircraft's tail, eyes fixed on the quote stenciled beneath its name, "Kindness isn't first class, it's every class." Marcellus approached silently. Jackson, startled. "Sir, sorry, I didn't know anyone else was here." "You're fine," Marcellus replied, "just visiting." Jackson hesitated, then said, "I was on the waiting list for Aquaflight twice. Thought I wouldn't make it. But after what happened on Flight 1065, I didn't just want to work here, I wanted to mean something here." Marcellus gave a small nod. "And now I walk down every aisle like it's a runway for change," Jackson said, then flushed slightly at his own poetic flourish. "That sounds dumb, doesn't it?" Marcellus smiled. "Not at all." Back on the rooftop, Rowan exhaled. "It's strange. Sometimes I forget what started all this." "I don't," Marcellus said, voice low. "I feel it when I board a plane and someone greets me like a person. Not a passenger profile. I feel it when Levi sleeps through a flight and no one asks me to make him quieter. I feel it when a stranger thanks me for doing nothing but staying calm." Rowan looked toward the stars. "Do you think it will last?" Marcellus answered after a moment. "It will, if we keep reminding them why it matters." Inside the house, the documentary played on a muted loop footage rolled across the screen. Levi being handed toy wings by a smiling attendant. A training session with the words, "See people not problems," on a digital board. And finally, Rowan's voice once more, closing out the segment. "I'd thank him." A pause. "Because sometimes it takes one slap to wake up a sleeping sky." He mocked the wrong family and went speechless when the captain addressed the owner's husband with respect. "If you believe justice boards first, subscribe now, because real authority needs no introduction. The story you just watched is fictional. It highlights racism, prejudice, and the shocking consequences that unfold when ignorance collides with truth and accountability. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, respect, and justice for every person, regardless of appearance or status."